Before wisdom made him famous, before gold filled his halls, before his name echoed across nations, a young man stood on the edge of a destiny he did not fully understand. The crown of Israel did not rest easily on his head because it carried the weight of bloodshed, promises, and the expectations of an entire people chosen by God. This was not the story of a warrior rising through conquest, but of a son stepping into a throne shaped by his father's faith and failures. And from the very beginning, the question was not whether Solomon would rule, but how he would rule, and whether his heart would remain steady when everything else around him began to rise. You are watching Biblical Story TV, a place where ancient truth comes alive today. From which country are you watching this video? Share it in the comments, and subscribe if you love learning from the Bible and growing in faith. Solomon became king at a moment of fragile peace. David, his father, had fought wars on every side, shedding blood to secure Israel's borders and unite the tribes. By the time Solomon ascended the throne, the battles had quieted, but the scars of conflict remained. The kingdom was strong, yet vulnerable, blessed, yet watching closely to see whether this young king could carry the responsibility placed upon him. Solomon was not the oldest son, nor the most obvious choice, but he was chosen by God, and that divine choice set him apart long before the people fully accepted him. He inherited not only a palace and an army, but a covenant, a sacred promise God had made to David that his line would endure if they walked faithfully before the Lord. From the first days of his reign, Solomon understood that leadership was more than authority. He saw how quickly power could collapse without obedience to God. The elders who stood around him remembered David's triumphs and David's sins, and Solomon knew the same God who lifted his father could also humble him. He ruled over a people who were not merely citizens, but a nation bound by divine law, a people whose success depended not on politics, but on faithfulness. Every judgment he made, every decision he faced, carried spiritual weight because Israel's king was accountable not only to the people, but to God himself. Not long after taking the throne, Solomon went to worship at Gibeon, where the sacred altar stood. This was not a public display of confidence, but an act of humility. He offered sacrifices to the Lord, acknowledging that no amount of royal authority could replace divine guidance. That night, something extraordinary happened. God appeared to Solomon in a dream, not with rebuke or warning, but with an open invitation that few humans in history have ever received. God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." In that moment, Solomon stood at a crossroads that would define his legacy. Solomon's response revealed the true condition of his heart. He did not pretend to be strong. He did not claim to have all the answers. He confessed his weakness openly before God, admitting that he was young, inexperienced, and uncertain how to lead such a great people. He remembered the kindness God had shown his father David, and he recognized that the throne he occupied was not earned, but entrusted. Instead of asking for wealth, victory over enemies, or long life, Solomon asked for wisdom, for an understanding heart to discern between right and wrong, so that he could govern God's people justly. This request reached the heart of God. It was not the words themselves that pleased the Lord, but the motive behind them. Solomon desired wisdom not for personal glory, but for service. He wanted to lead in a way that honored God and protected the people. And because Solomon asked for the right thing, God gave him more than he imagined. The Lord promised him wisdom unlike any before or after him, and along with it, riches, honor, and peace, blessings he had not even requested. When Solomon awoke, he returned to Jerusalem changed. Though nothing outward had shifted yet, everything inward had. The young king now carried a divine gift that would soon astonish the world. His reign would begin not with fear, but with discernment, not with force, but with understanding. At that moment, Solomon stood at the height of promise, a living example of what happens when humility meets divine favor, and the rise of Israel's greatest king had truly begun. The wisdom God placed within Solomon did not remain hidden for long. It flowed naturally into his words, his decisions, and the way he carried himself before the people. This was not the sharp intelligence of debate or the cleverness of strategy, but a deep, God-given understanding that reached into the heart of every matter. When Solomon spoke, his words carried weight because they were grounded in discernment. When he judged, his decisions brought peace because they were guided by truth. The people of Israel began to sense that something extraordinary rested upon their king, something beyond education or experience, something that could only come from the Lord. News of Solomon's wisdom spread quickly throughout the land. Elders sought his counsel. Leaders trusted his rulings. Common people brought their disputes before him with confidence, believing they would be heard and understood. Solomon became known not just as a king who ruled, but as a king who listened. He studied the ways of nature, the patterns of life, the struggles of the human heart. He spoke of plants and animals, of justice and mercy, of diligence and humility. His understanding touched every part of life, because wisdom from God is never limited to one area. It brings clarity wherever it goes. As time passed, Solomon's reputation crossed the borders of Israel. Merchants carried stories of his insight along trade routes. Travelers spoke of a king whose words could unravel the most difficult questions. Foreign rulers began to pay attention, not out of fear, but out of curiosity and respect. They did not hear of Solomon as a conqueror, but as a man whose God had given him understanding beyond measure. Israel, once known primarily for war and survival, was now known as a place where wisdom dwelled. Yet Solomon's wisdom was not theoretical. It was tested in the real conflicts of human life, where emotions run deep and truth can be difficult to uncover. One day, a case was brought before him that would become the defining moment of his early reign. Two women stood before the king, each claiming to be the mother of the same child. There were no witnesses, no evidence, only words, pain, and desperation. One woman spoke with grief, the other with insistence, and both claimed the child was theirs. The situation seemed impossible to resolve by ordinary means. The court grew quiet as Solomon listened. He did not rush to judgment. He allowed each woman to speak fully, understanding that wisdom requires patience before action. The air was heavy with tension, because the life of a child hung in the balance, and everyone knew that the king's decision would reveal whether the stories about his wisdom were true. This was not a political matter or a legal technicality. This was a human tragedy unfolding in real time. Then Solomon spoke words that shocked everyone present. He ordered that the living child be brought forward and declared that the child should be divided in two, with half given to each woman. Gasps filled the room. The command seemed cruel, even unthinkable. For a brief moment, it appeared as though wisdom had failed, as though the king had chosen brutality over compassion. But Solomon was not seeking destruction. He was revealing truth. One woman responded immediately with anguish. She begged the king to give the child to the other woman instead of killing him. Her words poured out in desperation, not for possession, but for the life of the child. The other woman, cold and resolute, agreed with the king's command, showing no concern for the child's survival. In that instant, the truth became clear. Solomon stopped the execution and declared that the child should be given to the woman who was willing to give him up to save his life. For she was the true mother. The wisdom of God had uncovered what human logic could not. Love had revealed itself, and justice had been served. The people who witnessed this judgment were filled with awe. They recognized that the king's wisdom was not a performance, but a divine gift. Fear of the Lord filled the nation. Not terror, but reverence, because they understood that God himself was working through Solomon to bring righteousness and peace. From that day forward, Solomon's authority was firmly established. People trusted his leadership because they saw that his wisdom protected the innocent and exposed deceit. His judgments were not driven by favoritism or fear, but by insight into the human heart. Israel flourished under a king who understood that true power lies not in force, but in discernment, not in pride, but in humility before God. Solomon's rise was no longer a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It had become a living reality, and the world was beginning to take notice. As Solomon's wisdom settled firmly over the nation, his heart turned toward a desire greater than palaces, borders, or wealth. He remembered the words of his father David, who had longed to build a permanent house for the name of the Lord, but had been forbidden because his life had been marked by war. That dream now passed to Solomon, not as a political ambition, but as a sacred responsibility. The tabernacle, which had served Israel faithfully through years of wandering and conflict, was no longer sufficient for a kingdom at rest. Solomon understood that the God who had given Israel peace on every side deserved a dwelling place that reflected his holiness, majesty, and covenant faithfulness. This was not about elevating Israel's status among nations, but about honoring the Lord who had chosen them. Solomon began preparations with great care and reverence. He gathered materials not hastily, but intentionally, using the finest cedar from Lebanon, stone-cut and shaped in silence, and gold refined to the highest purity. Craftsmen were selected not only for skill, but for wisdom and understanding. Every measurement, every design, every element of the structure was approached with fear of the Lord. The temple was not meant to impress human eyes alone, but to reflect divine order. Even before construction began, Solomon aligned himself with God through prayer, acknowledging that no building, no matter how magnificent, could truly contain the Creator of heaven and earth. When the temple was completed, its beauty surpassed anything Israel had ever known. The inner sanctuary was overlaid with pure gold, set apart as the most holy place. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence and promise, was brought into its resting place. When Solomon gathered the people for the dedication, leaders, elders, and citizens stood together in unity. As sacrifices were offered and praise rose, something extraordinary happened. The presence of the Lord filled the temple so powerfully that the priests could not stand to minister. The glory of God was not a concept or tradition in that moment. It was real, overwhelming, and unmistakable. Solomon then stood before the people and prayed a prayer that revealed the depth of his understanding. He did not boast in the achievement. He humbled himself, acknowledging that God alone keeps covenant and shows mercy. He asked that the temple would be a place of forgiveness, repentance, and restoration. He prayed for future generations, for those who would sin and return, for those who would cry out in times of famine, war, or exile. Solomon recognized that the temple was not a guarantee of blessing, but a meeting place between a holy God and a repentant people. Fire came down from heaven, consuming the sacrifices, and the people fell face down in worship, declaring that the Lord is good and his mercy endures forever. In that moment, Israel stood at the height of spiritual unity, centered not on a king, but on God himself. As the years passed, the blessings of God extended beyond spiritual favor into visible prosperity. Under Solomon's reign, Israel entered an era of wealth and stability unmatched in its history. Trade flourished, alliances were secured, and the kingdom expanded peacefully. Solomon organized his administration with precision, appointing officials, governors, and officers who ensured order throughout the land. Agriculture thrived, cities were fortified, and the people lived in safety, each under his own vine and fig tree. The peace God had promised became a daily reality. Wealth flowed into Jerusalem from every direction. Gold and silver filled the treasuries. Precious stones, rare woods, spices, and fine garments arrived from distant lands. Solomon's fleets traveled across seas, returning with riches and knowledge from places Israel had never known. His throne was adorned with gold, his palace unmatched in splendor, his court structured with excellence and dignity. Silver became so common that it was considered of little value, yet this prosperity was not the result of exploitation or conquest, but of favor, wisdom, and peace established by God. Solomon built not only the temple, but cities, storehouses, gardens, and halls of judgment. He created spaces of beauty and order, reflecting a kingdom at rest. From the outside, it appeared that every promise God had ever made to Israel was being fulfilled in abundance. The nations looked on with admiration and amazement. Israel, once a fragile people surrounded by enemies, now stood as a beacon of blessing. And at the center of it all stood Solomon, the king who had asked for wisdom and received far more than he imagined. Yet beneath the gold and grandeur lay an unspoken truth that would later shape Solomon's legacy. Prosperity, though a blessing, carries its own test. Wealth has a quiet way of shifting focus, of dulling dependence on God if the heart is not carefully guarded. At this point in Solomon's life, the kingdom appeared unshakable, and the favor of God seemed endless. But the same wisdom that built the temple and established peace would soon be tested by the abundance that surrounded him. And the story of Solomon would continue to unfold in ways no one yet expected. As Solomon's fame reached its height, stories of his wisdom traveled far beyond the borders of Israel, carried by merchants, diplomats, and rulers who spoke in hushed amazement of a king whose understanding seemed limitless. Among those who heard these reports was a powerful queen from the south, a ruler of great wealth and influence, who found the stories difficult to believe without seeing the truth for herself. She did not come out of idle curiosity, but with a discerning mind and a heart full of questions. She prepared a grand journey, bringing camels loaded with spices, gold in great abundance, and precious stones, symbols of both her status and her intent to test what she had heard. When she arrived in Jerusalem, she spoke openly with Solomon, laying before him every question that weighed upon her heart. These were not simple riddles meant to entertain, but deep matters concerning life, leadership, justice, and the nature of God. Solomon answered all of them. There was nothing hidden from him, nothing that left him uncertain or confused. His responses were not hurried or rehearsed, but flowed from a well of wisdom shaped by the fear of the Lord. As she listened, the queen realized that the reports she had heard did not exaggerate his greatness. They had barely captured it. She observed more than his words. She saw the order of his kingdom, the wisdom in the way his servants were organized, the excellence with which his officials carried out their duties, and the peace that rested over the land. She saw the food at his table, the dignity of those who served him, the joy that marked his court, and the reverence with which he approached the house of the Lord. The combined effect of wisdom, wealth, and worship left her breathless. In that moment, admiration turned into awe, and awe turned into praise, not directed toward Solomon alone, but toward the God who had placed him on the throne. She declared that the Lord must delight in Solomon, because only a God of righteousness and love would establish a king who ruled with such wisdom and justice. Her words echoed a truth that Solomon himself had once held close to his heart, that everything he possessed was the result of divine favor, not personal achievement. She gave Solomon lavish gifts, and he, in turn, gave her everything she desired and asked for, exceeding even her expectations. When she returned to her land, she carried with her not only treasures, but a testimony that the God of Israel was unlike any other. This encounter marked the peak of Solomon's public glory. Nations admired him, rulers sought his counsel. His name became synonymous with wisdom and success. Yet admiration has a subtle danger. Praise from others can quietly shift the focus of the heart, replacing humility with confidence and gratitude with entitlement. Though Solomon continued to honor God outwardly, a slow and almost imperceptible change began within him, one that did not arrive with rebellion, but with comfort. The peace of Solomon's reign brought new challenges. With no wars to fight and no enemies pressing at the gates, attention turned inward. Solomon began to strengthen political alliances through marriage, taking wives from surrounding nations. Each marriage was justified as a strategy for peace, a way to secure stability and influence. At first, these decisions appeared wise and harmless. There was no immediate collapse, no public rejection of God, but these alliances carried with them foreign customs, foreign beliefs, and quiet influences that would one day test the devotion of Solomon's heart. God had warned Israel's kings not to multiply wives, not because of numbers alone, but because divided affection leads to divided loyalty. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, knew this command, yet he allowed reason and success to soften his obedience. What began as tolerance slowly grew into accommodation. The presence of foreign wives brought foreign gods into the royal household, not openly at first, but subtly, as accepted practices rather than challenged ones. Solomon did not abandon the Lord in a single moment. His drift was gradual, marked by small compromises that seemed insignificant compared to the greatness of his achievements. He still spoke wisely. He still ruled effectively. The kingdom still prospered. But devotion, once wholehearted, began to share space with indulgence. The heart that had once asked only for wisdom now found satisfaction in abundance, pleasure, and admiration. This is how spiritual decline often begins, not with defiance, but with distraction. Solomon's life became crowded with responsibilities, luxuries, and relationships that slowly pulled his attention away from the simplicity of obedience. The temple still stood, sacrifices were still offered, but the intimacy that once defined his walk with God began to fade into routine. The king, who had once confessed his weakness before the Lord, now lived surrounded by constant reminders of his strength and success. The seeds of compromise had been planted, though their fruit was not yet visible. Solomon's wisdom had built a glorious kingdom, but wisdom alone could not guard his heart if it was no longer fully surrendered. The rise that had astonished the world now stood quietly at the edge of a turning point, where the greatest danger was not an enemy from without, but a divided heart from within. As the years passed, the quiet compromises in Solomon's life began to reshape his heart in ways that could no longer remain hidden. The foreign influences he had once tolerated now demanded space, and the affections he had divided could no longer be controlled by wisdom alone. Scripture says that when Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was no longer fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of his father David had been. This was not a sudden betrayal, but a slow erosion of devotion, where reverence gave way to accommodation and obedience gave way to justification. Solomon began to build high places for the gods of his wives, places of worship that stood in direct contrast to the temple he had built for the Lord. These altars were not hidden in secret corners of the land, but raised openly, visible reminders that the king, who once led Israel in pure worship, now allowed false gods to share space in the nation's spiritual life. The tragedy was not only that Solomon permitted idolatry, but that he participated in it. The man who had prayed with such humility at the dedication of the temple now bowed in places where the Lord had never placed his name. What made Solomon's fall especially painful was that he knew better. This was not ignorance or deception. God had appeared to him twice, speaking clearly, blessing him abundantly, and warning him plainly. Solomon understood the covenant, the promises, and the consequences. Yet knowledge without obedience proved powerless to guard his heart. Wisdom remained in his mind, but devotion had slipped from his soul. The king, who once asked God for an understanding heart, now allowed his heart to be shaped by desires that stood in opposition to the very law he had been entrusted to uphold. The Lord's response was firm, not because he delights in judgment, but because covenant demands faithfulness. God declared that because Solomon had turned away and had not kept his commands, the kingdom would be torn from his hand. Yet even in judgment, mercy appeared. For the sake of David, God would not take the kingdom during Solomon's lifetime. The consequences would fall upon his son. This was both a mercy and a burden, allowing Solomon to live out his reign while knowing that his choices had shaped a fractured future for the nation he loved. From that moment, the atmosphere of Solomon's reign began to change. The peace that had once seemed unbreakable started to crack. Adversaries arose against him, not by accident, but by divine allowance. Enemies who had once been subdued found strength again. Internal tensions grew. The unity of Israel, once anchored in shared devotion to God, now weakened as spiritual compromise filtered down from the throne into the hearts of the people. A divided king led to a divided nation. Solomon continued to rule, but the joy of his early years never fully returned. The grandeur remained, the wealth still flowed, and the structures he built continued to stand, but something essential was missing. The intimate favor of God that had once defined his leadership was replaced by a distant authority marked by regret. Solomon's wisdom did not vanish, but it now coexisted with the sorrow of knowing that obedience delayed is obedience denied. God's warning was not merely about punishment, but about the seriousness of devotion. The covenant was never about prosperity alone. It was about relationship. Solomon had been given everything a human could desire, yet he learned the painful truth that abundance cannot replace faithfulness. The king, who once stood as a living testimony of what God can do through a surrendered heart, now stood as a warning of what happens when that heart becomes divided. In the later years of his life, Solomon reflected deeply on meaning, purpose, and the emptiness of pleasure pursued apart from God. His writings reveal a man who had tasted wisdom, wealth, power, and indulgence, only to discover that without reverence for the Lord, all of it fades into vanity. These reflections were not the words of a fool, but of a man who had learned too late that the fear of the Lord is not only the beginning of wisdom, but its sustaining force. Solomon's story, at this stage, is not one of total abandonment, but of costly compromise. God did not erase his calling, but he did not ignore Solomon's disobedience. Mercy and judgment walked side by side, revealing a God who is patient, just, and faithful to his word. The consequences were set in motion, and the once unshakable kingdom now moved steadily toward division. The rise of Solomon had shown the world the beauty of wisdom submitted to God. His turning away now revealed how even the greatest gifts can be diminished when the heart no longer belongs fully to the one who gave them.